We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm sure the whole Chamber will join me in wishing Paisley well in their bid to become the UK City of Culture 2021. The bid team has run an incredible campaign, and we all wish them well for this evening. And to ask the First Minister, after yesterday's events, why is the Scottish Government continuing to persist with its named persons scheme? First Minister.
Well, firstly, let me also take the opportunity to wish Paisley 2021 the very, very best of luck this evening. All of Scotland is behind the bid. The bid team have done an absolutely fantastic job, and I'm sure the whole country are proud of them and will rejoice if Paisley indeed does win the bid this evening, as all of us hope that it will. The Scottish Government will proceed with its named person plans for the simple reason that they are in the best interests of children, particularly vulnerable children, across the country. Often when Ruth Davidson raises this issue, she does so from a political perspective. That is her right. The Tories oppose named person in principle, but when we talk about it from the perspective of the protection of children. And I would submit, Presiding Officer, that is the most important, indeed the only consideration that should drive us. In terms of the committee decision, there have been concerns expressed at and by the committee about the draft Code of Guidance. The draft Code of Guidance is exactly that. It was always intended to be illustrative, and of course the Deputy First Minister has committed to working with practitioners to develop the final Code of Practice. He has also established a Practice Development Board panel that will be led by Ian Welsh, and of course crucially has committed to giving this Parliament the final say on the draft Code of Practice. So we are disappointed with the committee decision. We think it is unnecessary to delay stage 1, although we recognise that and will now work with the committee and the Bureau in terms of the timing. But in the meantime, we will go on with the important work of developing that Code of Practice, because I will end this answer where I started it. It is about the protection of children. This bill is not about the principle of named person, it's about the information sharing that is necessary to ensure that vulnerable children don't fall through the gaps in services.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, we all want to protect vulnerable children, but after yesterday's events, it's clear that this is not the way to do it. So let's run through the timeline here. The original legislation was passed in 2014. It was ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court in 2016. The Education Committee of this Parliament has said it can't provide a report because of the lack of clarity on how changes would work. And now we're told it won't be until late 2018 before the Scottish Government can even provide a satisfactory code of practice. So far, the only people who have benefited from this mess are the lawyers who have coined in over £800,000 in legal fees. Given that record, does the First Minister honestly think that this policy can be salvaged?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I think Ruth Davidson should be very careful not to inadvertently mislead, because she said that the Supreme Court said that the named person policy was unlawful. As anybody who reads the judgment, the principle of named person was said by the Supreme Court to be benign and legitimate. The Supreme Court made a number of pronouncements about the information sharing provisions, and it's those information sharing provisions that this bill is intended to address. And of course, information sharing is vital. It is vital as part of efforts of those working in the front line to protect children, particularly vulnerable children. In the words of Social Work Scotland, information sharing is vital to getting it right for every child. Now, Ruth Davidson has asked me about the timeline, and I do think it is a bit rich for a party that has sought to politically undermine and delay named person at every juncture, and is now supporting a committee decision that would further delay the introduction of named person, to somehow criticise this government for it taking too long to be introduced. So we will continue to do what we said we would do, which is work with practitioners through the new panel that has been established on the final Code of Conduct and give Parliament the final decision on this. I would lastly say, Ruth Davidson says that all of us are concerned with the protection of children. I certainly hope that that is the case. But if that is the case, then I would hope that all of us would pay attention to what those on the front line working with vulnerable children say, and a whole range of organisations, notwithstanding the concerns that I concede they had about the draft code of guidance, a range of organisations called on the committee to pass the bill at stage 1 so that that continued work on the code of guidance could be continued. I think that's a sensible way forward, but we will continue, notwithstanding the developments of yesterday, to develop that final code so that we can go on with putting in place measures that are fundamentally about protecting children.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, the weaknesses of this policy have been exposed by the lengths that the government has gone to try and prop it up. And the Deputy First Minister has already been forced to apologise over the failings in the new bill. And we've now discovered that witnesses to the Parliamentary Committee have been lobbied by the Scottish Government in advance of their appearance. And the Government says that this is entirely innocent, which is OK. So if there is nothing to hide, will the First Minister publish the minutes and the attendees list of these private meetings with the committee witnesses so that we can all see what's been going on?
First Minister.
Well, look, if Ruth Davidson is seriously standing up in this chamber today suggesting that a government taking through legislation on an important issue like this one should not seek to engage with and talk to about their concerns with organisations like Aberlour, like Children's Health Scotland, like One Parent Families Scotland, like Enable Scotland, like Social Work Scotland, then I think Ruth Davidson is demonstrating why she should never be anywhere near government in Scotland. It is our duty. It is our duty as a government to listen to the concerns that organisations like that have and seek to address those concerns. And it is on the basis of those discussions that the organisations, such as those that I've read out, have said that they think the committee should pass the bill at stage 1 to allow the Scottish Government to continue to work with them to address their concerns and finalise the code. I think that's the sensible way to proceed. And if this is about the protection of children, rather than political point scoring, then I think that's the way all of us should be determined to proceed. Let's put children at the centre of this debate.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, it's usual that organisations lobby government, not government that lobbies organisations. But what the First Minister isn't understanding is that the policy is a mess, and it's only her and the Deputy First Minister that can't seem to see it. Everybody wants protection for vulnerable children, but it's now clear that Parliament has joined the public in no longer having confidence in these plans. We should focus resource on those who actually need it, rather than having blanket interference for every family in Scotland. We are willing to get round the table to find a fresh solution for this, but first, the First Minister needs to ditch this broken plan, because her named person policy is in tatters. Can she simply concede that so we can all move on?
First Minister.
Well, let me explain the difference between the Tories and this government when it comes to engaging with stakeholders. Yes, stakeholders lobby the Tories when they are in government, and the Tories ignore them. Organisations lobby this government, and we respond and seek to address the concerns that they have. That is how responsible government operates. Now, Ruth Davidson says this should be about reflecting the opinion not just of Parliament but about people outside of Parliament. And I think we should pay particular attention to those who do work on the front line with children, and particularly vulnerable children. So I am about to read out the second paragraph of a letter signed by Children in Scotland, Aberlour, the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, Action for Children, the Institute for Inspiring Children's Futures, Crossreach, Social Work Scotland, Children's Health Scotland, COSLA, Includem, One Parent Families Scotland and Enable Scotland. And this is what this letter from all of these organisations said. This is a letter to the Education and Skills Committee. We are writing to ask you to approve the bill at stage 1 in order to allow time for the Scottish Government to demonstrate its commitment to making improvements to it and to the proposed code of practice. That's what those working on the front line with children want us to do, and I think as a Parliament we should listen to them and respond. Yeah.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Investment in the arts and culture can be a pathway to economic regeneration and employment, but it can also lift the horizons of the people. So can I take this opportunity to also extend the support of the Scottish Labour Party to the people of Paisley in their bid to be the City of Culture for the United Kingdom? Of course, the bid has been initiated and led by the local council. And, Presiding Officer, last week I asked the First Minister if Scotland's 32 councils will get the over £500 million of funding that they need just to stand still to maintain local services. But I received no answer. Presiding Officer, austerity is not an abstract concept. It means real cuts to real local services. It means the closure of breakfast clubs. It means the axe falling on holiday activity programmes for children with disabilities. In the real world, it means cutting teachers for children who have additional support needs. How can the First Minister possibly justify those kinds of cuts to local services?
First Minister.
Well, Richard Leonard asked me last week what the budget would have in store for local government, and I said to him last week that he would find out in 2 weeks' time when Derek Mackay presented the budget to this Parliament. I can update that answer today. He will now find out in 1 week's time when Derek Mackay presents the budget to Parliament 1 week today. And what I can tell Richard Leonard is this, that just as we have done in previous years, this government will do everything that we possibly can to protect frontline services from the impact of Tory-imposed austerity. We face in the coming financial year a cut to our day-to-day spending in real terms of more than £200 million imposed by the Tory government, that Richard Leonard still prefers to have control over these issues than he would prefer it to be a government in this Parliament. But I, in response to Richard Leonard last week, also pointed out that the only councils for this financial year that hadn't taken the opportunity to maximise their revenues through the council tax were Labour-led councils. So if Richard Leonard is concerned about the kind of services that he has talked about, then perhaps he can address that point now. Why is it only Labour councils that this year are not using every penny at their disposal to protect frontline services?
Richard Leonard.
Well, Presiding Officer, I have to report to Parliament that these cuts to children's services, which I listed, are not just being planned by any council, they are being planned by the SNP on Falkirk Council. And they were discussing it just yesterday. And new figures published just last week show that 39% of children in Falkirk live in material deprivation. Meanwhile, this SNP council is planning to cut to the bone childcare, is planning to close down breakfast clubs, is planning to axe teachers for children with additional support needs. So the question is this: does the First Minister believe that if she fails next week to properly resource councils, to properly invest in local services, that we will see this material deprivation faced by Scotland's children go down, or will it go up?
First Minister.
Not just protecting the health service, protecting as far as we possibly can local services. We're investing further amounts of money directly in our schools through the Pupil Attainment Fund, and we will continue to do that. And when the budget is published next week, all councils, whoever leads them, will be able to finalise their own budget plans. And when Richard Leonard and others see the budget next week, they will see evidence of a government continuing to protect frontline services where it matters most. But Richard Leonard still hasn't addressed the point. If it is his position that he thinks local government are short of cash, then why are Labour councils not maximising the money that they have to spend? But the final point I would make is this: if Labour want to have a proper constructive discussion, it's about time they brought forward some concrete proposals. Richard Leonard wrote to Derek Mackay late last week about the budget. There wasn't a single figure in the letter, not a single concrete proposal about what should be spent and how that money should be raised. So if Richard Leonard wants to be taken seriously, then actually engage in a proper constructive discussion, and then we might start to take him seriously as well.
Richard Leonard.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. One of the things that too many children living in material deprivation miss out on is a new winter coat to keep warm. Yesterday, I visited the cottage in Kirkcaldy and had the privilege of meeting with volunteers, including a selfless group of pupil volunteers from Balweary High School. They were sorting out parcels for needy families for Christmas, winter coats, scarves and gloves to be delivered to families who are living in abject poverty. This is the reality of Tory Britain, and it is the reality of SNP Scotland.
Order, please. Order, please.
It's a Dickensian Scotland where too many families. It's a Dickensian Scotland where too many families are forced to turn to food banks. A Dickensian Scotland where school children are dispatching emergency parcels to help their classmates at Christmas. First Minister, if cuts to children's services are imposed by you, you are not standing up for Scotland, you are failing the children of Scotland. So will you use the powers? Will you show the political will? Will you stop Tory austerity in its tracks and protect the funding of these vital services? Yes or no?
First Minister.
Well, when Derek Mackay sets out the budget a week today, what he will show are the actions of this government, which will stand in stark contrast to the empty rhetoric of the Labour Party opposite. But poverty and child poverty in particular is an issue of the utmost seriousness. The Joseph Roundy Foundation, of course, published a report in the last couple of weeks that showed that poverty is lower in Scotland than it is elsewhere in the UK, and that child poverty has fallen faster and more sustainably in Scotland than elsewhere in the UK. But my view is a very simple view. As long as one child is living in poverty, that is one child too many, and we have got more work to do. That is why this government has recently legislated for statutory targets on child poverty, making us the only administration in the UK now to have statutory targets. It's why we have established our Poverty and Inequality Commission to advise and to challenge the government to go further. And of course, it's why in the programme for government we outlined our intention to set up a new Tackling Child Poverty Fund. I could list a whole range of other areas, from council tax reduction to free school meals and a whole host of other policies from this government, many of them happening in Scotland and not happening anywhere else in the UK, about tackling child poverty. And we will continue to show the priority we attach to that through not just our budget, but every single policy we pursue.